Good morning. You are in the right place if you're looking for GDPR, identity assurance, and privacy. And our last two sessions were dealing more with GDPR. We're going to transition now more to the identity assurance aspects. David Kelts is going to talk to us about how identity proofing and privacy can go hand in hand and can be friends. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to David, who is the Director of Product Architect for MorphoTrust. David?
Awesome. So lots of great sessions at CIS. Nothing's really more important than the first thing you do when you encounter your users in identity, which is proof them, right? So everybody who's not in here must have sufficiently proofed their users already. So what I'm going to do is really three things here. I want to talk about why you would want to add identity proofing or add identity assurance to accounts that you're already holding. Break down what proofing is and do some comparisons of proofing and the concepts there, and then see how you could reassemble them so that for accounts you're already holding, you can add some of the identity assurance values of proofing to those accounts so that you more accurately target who your users are. So looking at why, when you break down then for NIST new 863, it's broken identity assurance and authentication assurance into two different numbers, which is a positive. And identity assurance really applies at enrollment time, so this is proof. All the slides will be available afterwards. However, feel free to like tweet. I put my handle in the front, so put me on, I'll retweet you and all that stuff. Identity assurance, so at enrollment time, and proofing, how to do proofing, that's 800-63A. Proofing is an event. And then over on the right is assurance. So at transaction time, how you authenticate the user and more accurately know that it's the same user coming back. Well, there's this middle zone here that's identity assurance, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. And this is where we can take a lot of action. We can do things after that proofing event or after the lack of a proofing event. When you add up these new numbers, I kind of always go through this math with people. IAL1 plus AAL1 equals LOA2. So these levels of assurance are part of a balance between the proofing value and the authentication value. And when you look at that balance, roughly on the left there is the identity assurance, on the bottom, authentication assurance. These things come together to create the LOAs in the middle as you step up. There's a lot of action right now and over the last couple of years in authentication, FIDO Alliance, and a lot of people adding second factor to their accounts, adding multi-factor authentication. This is awesome. This is absolutely the thing you want to be doing. What this does is moves you over to the right. So and there are appropriate use cases, as Paul Grassi was mentioning yesterday, for like an IAL1 proof with a high level of authentication. It's like you don't really want to know who the person is, but you want to know that it really is the same visitor from before. However, if you want to really create that balance, if you want to get that balance, you add identity assurance, add the value of proofing to the accounts to bring yourself up back into these LOA zones. So this is part of why you want to do this. And then, in addition, so there's a lot of reputation systems out there right now. A reputation system will reduce risk, and you don't see it listed on the left here. It'll reduce risk for you, but it's not going to help you if, say, the 99% operator within your system who was selling things has an awesome reputation. They go bad. Now, how do you find them? So that's the value that you're going to get from proofing, is knowing who, tying it to that legal identity. So let's look at proofing and break it down. I forgot to start my timer, so you can feel free to, okay. Let's break down proofing, the proofing event. Really three things you're trying to do at an identity proof. You're trying to first, and they happen kind of simultaneously. You're trying to resolve down to one historical identity. You're trying to get a set of attributes and qualify those attributes so that you know you've got one person and you know who that one person is. And I'll go into that in a little more detail as well. Then you have what I call evidence qualification. So you're gathering documentation from this user who may be standing in front of you, and you're trying to both authenticate the documents that you have. You want to know that they're real, that they're genuine, that they're unaltered, and then you're also trying to validate the data that you're pulling off of these documents or that you're getting from the user. And then identity verification. So the third, that's knowing that the person who's standing there or virtually standing there in front of you is the person for whom this documentation exists. And I would argue this is an authentication to the record that you're building. And you want to build a record that can be authenticatable in the future. The user can use as authentication in the future. So you're building a resolved, qualified record of identity for that digital subject. And these are the main steps. I'm going to go a little into detail on them. So looking first at resolution. There's a set of attributes that, a minimum set of attributes that you could say, I know who this person is. And if you're talking about legal identity, that's typically a birth, right? So the likelihood that a person with that legal name at that date of birth, at that place of birth, that there's two of them is pretty remote. So you're trying to gather enough so that you can say, this is distinct. I've resolved this to be one distinct identity. There's also a lot of additional attributes that you would use in use cases for legal identity, or that you might sub in if you don't have a place of birth. You sub these in order to resolve down to that one person. Then the evidence qualification part, I clicked the wrong button. Really, I broke this down into two pieces, data validation and document authentication. For data validation, and this is really straight from, this is the document that changed my life, NIST, the NISTer 8112 for attribute metadata, or assurance of attributes. And there's really three concepts here that you're trying to look for, these identity attributes that you have, that you're trying to qualify them in the best way, these attributes. Provenance, you heard Ian mention it this morning, right? He's in his step 5, right? So you're trying to go back as far as you can in history to see the authoritativeness of this particular identity attribute. So you go back to the source for that attribute, or back as far as you can to validate the attribute. Freshness, which is that concept of it being, not being out of date. And I'll go into this as these two things as well. And then the document authentication. So in the physical world, you've seen these things when you bring your documents that we do. So the design of what I call the heft of a document, you get it and you sort of feel that it's authentic. That's really one thing, and there's training for that. Or there's also like UV and IR light tricks that you do when you see them shine the little UV light on, or close-up visual inspection that can see the security features. People can be trained in how to do document authentication, but this might not apply to you because that person might not be in front of you. They might be uploading the document. So in that case, there's a lot going on right now in the white light scanning area. So taking a camera photo of a document, taking a scan off a platen, and trying to authenticate it. And a lot of the techniques in biometrics for pattern recognition are starting to be applied into documents and evolving so that there's now APIs coming out to say, hey, if I upload this document image, I can see a likelihood of how authentic it is. So put those two things together, the document authentication and the data validation at the source, and you can know, hey, this document itself looks unaltered, it looks authentic, and I just checked with the source of it to know what. So now those scans and uploads that you might have been asked to do, PayPal, Airbnb, where they're uploading them, with these APIs, those can start to really have some meaning, those document uploads. So let's look at proofing and the proofing events. I tried to break down proofing into these three things, and I've got more of these slides. So if people are like, hey, I want to know what the passport does, I can provide you some of it, but really just chose 3 of them for now. Know your customer, which when you look at this, you say, that's pretty light on requirements, right? There's really no requirements for resolution. There's really no requirements for the verification other than the operator visually checks your ID. So I think this really falls into the identity verification zone. But There is a set of attributes that banks are required to collect. Financial institutions, for Know Your Customer, is a pretty, you need some proof from a document of legal name, permanent address, and collect these other things. Collect a date of birth, collect a unique identifying number. But many banks have gone farther than this. These are the minimums. Many banks have gone farther than this so that it does start to approach an identity proof. But that's where Know Your Customer is, at least on a baseline. When you go to what the DMV is doing, there's some additional attributes that they're proving out. So in addition to legal name, commonly used names, permanent address, date of birth, signature. Signature is interesting because it's on the face of the card. But there's also now requirements in the resolution zone and in the verification zone. And there's a lot of processing that a DMV will do, including checking with a previous state of record, verifying histories, seeing where name changes are, social security number checks. So they'll do things that are trying to aid in this resolution so that they know that one identity. And they've done a seriously good job at it. And then also in the verification, where they've gone past what an operator does and added biometric verifications to what the operator is doing when you bring in your documentation. Added that to the operator's feeling about the proofing event. And then anti-forgery efforts like doc training. So, and validating the data against, so this is like sort of a standard of what the DMV has done, and then they've evolved over the last several years to Real ID, which added some additional requirements from the outside on the attributes such as nationality and legal presence in the US, proof of a social security number, and validating those things with places like SAVE, services like SAVE for foreign residents. Added as well additional processing to ensure that you've got one person for this one record. So now you've got additional requirements in each of those areas. When you compare these out, as I said, there's several things you need to know. Know Your Customer really is an identity verification, but you can take it some steps further. If your requirements that you have to face are, I need KYC requirements, there's a lot of these sort of techniques or the areas in identity proofing that you can add. I feel like I'm slow. 10, okay. I'm going to talk about identity assurance. I don't think I have to talk about accuracy of an attribute in computer systems, but I'll talk about those two other areas, freshness and provenance. Every attribute that you're holding has a decay rate. And I would organize the decay rates on the right here. So from things like date of birth, place of birth that are really never going to change. And you get into like sex and citizenship that will rarely or occasionally change for people, down to things like address, which for many might be yearly that changes. So look at those decay rates, assess them, and say, how often do I need to go back and revalidate this particular attribute that I'm holding in order to know its freshness? Because they will get stale. And using the attribute or authentications of those attributes can help. But then you get to, when you are going to validate it, how far back do you want to reach? So this diagram sort of shows the provenance of an attribute. This is the authoritativeness of the source of which you're checking. When you go to 63A, it's attributes that validate against information issued by the source, at the issuing source, or published by the issuing source. So that means going back to those left-hand two. Go to the original birth registry, go to the proofing authority. Now, you might look at that and say, I don't know if I have access to these things. So even over the last year, more of these things are coming online so that you can do validations against them. Take a look back, because you really do want to go as far back to the left as you can. The aggregated sources of these, and lots of them, they're probably the easiest ones to find, but that it's, there's less authoritativeness. There's more susceptibility to change in the attribute or to error from decay rate as you go from left to right here. And then the one that I really don't see in 63A is about whether you could, if you've got a token of this, if you've got a document and you know that it's authentic, you authenticated it, can you validate the attributes against the document and establish the authoritativeness of that? That's kind of not specified, but I think that's an option, especially when there's cryptographic measures to assure the data is the same. So again, now let's look at your accounts. These are the user accounts that you're holding. These are the goals. You want to strengthen these proofing concepts, and you want to validate the attributes that you have against these assurance concepts. So better resolving the identity, gathering some more evidence from your user, qualifying that evidence, making sure that the physical user is the one that for whom your identity record is intended to be used. And then the question comes up, how? So let's take a look at how. I broke this down into, and I roughly categorized this. You can see the color gradations, or maybe you can't, depending on the lighting. From IAL 1 to 2 to 3. Excuse me. So you can, of course, scan and authenticate identity documents. This is one way that you can start to move your way from self-assured attributes up the IAL chain. Although you're not going to score this as IAL, you're going to score this as identity assurance. But that's one pathway here, and there's things like there's several vendors that have either mobile versions or scanning and manipulating the image versions. Of course, you subject to presentation attack detection here, but this is you're trying to just move up the chain. Being able to take the attributes from those documents, or take the attributes that you hold and validate them, is another potential pathway. So here you've got some sources. U.S. federal agencies hopefully will start to put make available for commercial use, AMVA as well, for commercial use, the ability to validate these the attributes that you're holding, and then go up a step further, and now you want to tie that user, the physical user, to the documentation. And there's things like Confirm.io, Identics APIs. There's APIs that are starting to come out for you to be able to do a biometric comparison as well. Interesting, you look at Touch ID. I forgot to mention this earlier. Look at Touch ID, and a lot of people will allow their kids to enroll their fingerprint on their phone so their kid can unlock their phone and play games. Well, guess what? In Touch ID, that means that you can now run the E-Trade account too. And smart service providers have figured this out and put a big warning up in the front of it. So I think it's important to know that you've tied that biometric back to the proofing event itself. So the strength of that tie of the biometric comparison, all the way back to the person you originally proofed, is also something you should look at doing. You can bind to another high IAL account. So in the MyCard NSTIC grant, which is part of the grant that MorphoTrust is in, we're trying to demonstrate this out. Bind yourself using OpenID Connect to another high assurance account and use it as your attribute freshness. In fact, use it to enhance privacy. Use it to not store attributes in your own system. Take away that liability for yourself and bind it well to another account. Or even take that a step further. I don't want identity accounts. I don't want to hold the data. I don't want the liability. I'll accept an OpenID. So, and accept it externally. Accept it at the level of assurance or the IAL that you want. Screen for those ones that are IAL 3 or higher. And even just proofing the individual, and you could bring them into your location and run them through an identity proof. Of course, that would get you to IAL 3 or get you to your Know Your Customer requirements that you need to meet. There's in-person services in the U.S. Identigo. There's Timpson and others that I know of in the UK. So you could also sort of outsource that, depending on what you need for that assurance level. So there's lots of steps that you can take that are going to get yourself to up this chain. All right, that was a lot of information, I know, in a very short time frame. So we left some time for questions, and I can go back to any of the particular slides, and I do know the slides are available as well. So, Deidre.
Yeah, on this point right here, adding identity assurance to your accounts and being able to assert when someone authenticates what level of assurance they're at. I think one of the challenges, there's no common data schema that a lot of services use. And I work in higher ed where there's this EduPerson schema that a lot of us use, and there's an attribute called EduPerson Assurance. So I have a mindset of how to add a value into the EduPerson Assurance attribute so that we can know what level of assurance they're at. Is there anything similar on the enterprise side, like how you, in a standard way, assert the level of assurance?
So on the enterprise side, there hasn't been much that I know of. However, and it was actually scheduled at the same time of this, like the iGov profile of OpenID Connect, there's a session at the same time. I do believe eventually there'll be a data map that'll be put in there. So this would be sort of a legal person. I don't know if that's the right term or what the term will end up being. I know in Canada they were starting to verified person. I think that might be a nice term for it. Where some of these additional attributes that are part of the schema that I showed you in the two pie charts will be in that. So I would say that probably comes out through iGov. It may come out through, I'm on an ISO working group doing mobile driver's license. It may come out through there. At some point, I think there'll be one soon. And I agree completely. It's really important that we come to a common data model here so that when you are assuring them. Also mention that slide about the NISTer 8112 has metadata attributes about the attribute that you're holding. So provenance, freshness measures, accuracy measures, even privacy considerations. So holding metadata as well about the attributes and working that into the schema will be. Jeff?
David, is there something that proofing is not? For example, if I need LOA4 or IAL3, the higher levels of assurance, is it enough to say that just scanning a license and comparing with my own application that the face matches, is that sufficient to meet the high requirements, or is there a requirement built into the standards to verify that information against the actual issuer?
There are requirements. So IAL3 has requirements that would, well, first of all, it currently has a requirement of in-person for the proofing event. So I would argue that's achievable, that we can go and do this remotely. But the key things are getting back far enough back in that provenance chain so that you can measure the authoritativeness of the source of which you're validating those attributes. And as well, if you can do that with the photo, or you could do that with a fingerprint, and get it back to that source and match against something at the source, I'd argue you can start to get into that IAL3 proofing zone remotely. But did that fully answer the question?
Yeah, I believe so. So essentially, it's not enough to compare a credential against a data broker. You actually need to go back to proofing source in order to.
Yes, I mean the quality of aggregated sources or algorithmically compiled sources could be really good, but let's get these APIs online that go back to the source, the issuers of the documents, and the birth records and death records. Let's get these sources online, especially in the US, they are in other countries, and be able to test against them.
David, so the image on the driver's license is pretty low res, right? So when you're comparing that against, what are you comparing that against to understand if the biometric verification that you referred to? Because you need a pretty high resolution image on the other side to compare that against. Because if you take a selfie and then you compare that against the image on the photo, on the driver's license, you may not get a very good match most of the time. Is that something a solution, or how do you think about that problem? Given that.
So fortunately, the cameras on mobile. So I think that the capture source, you would want to make sure you have sufficient resolution for the biometric matches. Typically, it's like a number of pixels between the eyes that works, 128. So you do want to get a high enough resolution. Fortunately, I think like the front-facing cameras at this distance are really pretty good at capturing a high enough, a high enough resolution image of the person's face for that matching. I would agree that what's on the card is a little bit muddled, to begin with. So, and it's a difficult, I mean, we've run tests with the matches of like selfie to cropped off a DL, and it is a little bit of a tough match, but there's some techniques to apply scores. I think some of those techniques are starting to be surfaced in the APIs that I mentioned so that you can get a little more distinction or accuracy in the match. So you may want to try one of those APIs. And then, if possible, look and see if you can make an arrangement to go back to the source of the data that you're gathering from and perform the biometric match.
Just one other question. Regarding the connections to authoritative sources for data validation like AMVA in the states, are all the states beginning to open up and allow an API to check the validity of a document against the databases, or is it only a few select states right now?
It is select states right now, but I think there's a lot of momentum and effort to try and expose that a little bit more and to go beyond the domains where you can currently validate. So like the states themselves or the federal agencies have access to this. For law enforcement has access. Commercially, I think this is where we need this next step and really sort of need the privacy protections and requirements in place within an ecosystem so everybody knows when I access this data, both actors are acting well, and it won't get leaked, and the privacy protections in the APIs that say, I'm going to send data that I collected in, I'm just going to get back a yes or no, and therefore that allows the data to stay there. I think those concepts are important, and there's just a few states now, but there'll be a lot. Start asking data sources that you want, like, can I please, I want to validate data against you. I've got this data. I don't want to hold bad data, and I don't want to do that disservice to my users. I don't want to create distortion of their, who they are, and I don't want to turn to algorithmic sources. Let's help. And I think they will start to come online, and they are now starting to come online in the U.S., maybe more in other places.
Thanks, David. We have time for 2 more quick questions, and I know that David will be available offline for anyone who doesn't get in queue right now.
So you mentioned in-person for IAL3. Mm-hmm. There's also the video in-person, like ID Now in Europe. They're dealing with refugees with the Bundesbanks and some other things. And I'm just curious because I haven't seen any companies doing this to date. I've seen like banks where you have, like Bank of America has you can hit a button to get a person to help you over video. But I'm just curious if you've seen any companies kind of doing the video in-person in the US.
Good question. I don't know that I've seen it. I haven't seen it myself. I think there's a company in Quebec called Notarius. I think they may have that. I don't know. Kat might know, actually, if there's some doing it. No, you don't know? So, Andrew. Yeah, Notarius
So check with Andrew
has
Hughes.
that.
Right over here.
I have concerns about, we should be applying technology to solve these problems. That means this is a good move forward to look at whether you can do this. Securing that from end to end so that it's not redirectable is a hard problem. And that's the requirements in 63A right now, is secure it end to end. I don't know that that's even feasible to do on the internet today, but we should definitely look at how we do that.
Okay, and we have one last question.
Hi, David. So is this meant to be a request response system, or is it do you actually capture some of the attributes and for form fills and things like that to improve the user experience?
So I was starting from an assumption that you've got identity accounts that you're holding, that you're within your own system, that you're using to provide service to your users. And that seems to be the predominant enterprise, or even on the web, web service providers have their own accounts. I was starting from that assumption and saying that if you want to move outward from there and add the value of identity assurance, here's techniques that you can use. So that was kind of where I started from, as opposed to sort of request response, sort of starting from that point.
Thank you, David.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We're going to take a couple minutes break, and we'll get going on the next session.